Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this year's conversation series with Àlex Gómez-Marín. He's the director of the Pari Center. This year's series is entitled The Future World. Àlex Gómez-Marín is a Spanish scientist and theoretical physicist turned neuroscientist investigating human consciousness. Since 2016, he has been the director of the Organisms Behavior Laboratory at the Institute of Neuroscience in Alicante, where he is currently an associate professor at the Spanish National Research Council. Àlex had a near-death experience in March of 2021, and since then he has decided to devote his research efforts to the scientific study of human minds in the real world, concentrating on what he calls the edges of consciousness, a wild, weird, wonderful field where great enigma meets gross stigma. In 2024, Àlex was selected as one of the world's most inspiring people and recently has been nominated as one of the 10 revolutionary scientists by Feed Your Head. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Àlex. Welcome.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting my introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's really wonderful to be again with you. So first of all, I'm deeply grateful that John Vervaeke has accepted our invitation to be with us today virtually. I met John last summer in Scotland at a wonderful gathering organized by Wonderstruck. Elizabeth Robert brought us there, and I of course knew of John's work, but I never had the chance to talk to him, let alone meet him in person. And it was fantastic to see the breadth and depth of what he brings to cognitive science and philosophy and practice. So I immediately asked him whether he would come to Paris, and here we are. It's also special to introduce today because we are starting yet another series. You know, I change the name or the surname every year. This started being called The Future Scientist, then The Future Human, then The Future Mind, and this year The Future World. Well, we're always trying to talk about the same thing, and we're always trying to do the same thing, which is have two people in dialogue, in conversation, and hoping that this third thing emerges in between, also amongst all of you. Maybe this year, The Future World, given how weird and catastrophic life seems, and at the same time how beautiful it is, well, I think we would be reflecting on that more explicitly. And also, I have two daughters, and maybe I'm becoming old. I start to think, where are we going to leave them? And also about my granddaughters, which is a weird thought for me. Before I introduce John and we'll jump into the conversation, let me also tell you that John will be in person in Paris in May from the 9th to the 12th for one of these special in-person workshops we've been doing now one every year. So that will be 2025 special workshop event. It's called Unbreaking the World, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and the Return of the Sacred. And we'll be talking about what we are going to talk today about and more. And so let me now introduce you, John, and then we'll jump into it. So John Vervaeke is an award-winning professor of psychology, cognitive science, and Buddhist psychology at the University of Toronto. He has a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Toronto and has served as the former director of cognitive science and holds the position of associate professor in the Department of Psychology. John has won and been nominated for several teaching awards, and teaching is very important. We'll talk about this, and has published articles on relevance, realization, general intelligence, mindfulness, flow, metaphor, and wisdom. He has an expertise both in Eastern and Western philosophy and weaving them together. And John guides learners through a transformative journey, integrating ancient wisdom and modern scientific insights, also on the spirit of what we attempt here at the Pari Center. And John teaches a lot, and his courses are a captivating blend of theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, and his dynamic teaching styles engages students in exploring the depth of the mind and its implication for personal growth and societal change, illuminating the path to a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. So cannot get better than this. Welcome, John.
Wow. Thank you, Alex. That was a little bit overwhelming, but I appreciate I appreciate the introduction. I hope I live up to it in this conversation. I am comforted by the fact that I'll be talking with you.
Right. So formalities aside, what's this meaning crisis? What's this malaise? What is going on? What's lost? Why is it different this time?
So that's an important question, and it's a question that I'm engaging in some serious theoretical work on right now. In that I'm sort of doing a self-correction for something that went into Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, both the series and the book, which is I sort of adopted the psychological construct of meaning in life without much criticism, which is very odd for me to do, since I tend to take established constructs like mindfulness and rationality and wisdom and do huge theoretical critiques. And I've come to the realization that there's some things deeply wrong with the standard meaning in life metric, and and that has to do with the fact that we're getting some very inconsistent results. Like we have some standard scientific, surveys and questionnaire in which people are sort of doing above average in meaning in life. They have friends and they have family and they have projects, and that seems to be working out. But then you get a national poll in the UK in 2019, and 80% of young people say their lives are meaningless, and 60% or more of adults say their lives are meaningless. And so, what's going on here? Um, and so, once you get what the problem in the problem in the construct actually helps give us a deeper understanding of what the meaning crisis is, because one of the ways in which it has to be understood is it's very insidious in an important fashion. So the problem with the standard construct, and this reflects some deep problems with our current orientation to the world and to our knowledge projects, is that it takes meaning to be a merely descriptive term. And that the problem with that is that meaning is not a merely descriptive term. It's not like tall, it's like rational or intelligent. It's both a descriptive and a praising term. When you say she has a meaningful life, you're not just describing her, you're praising her. You're recommending her life to be admired or even followed in some fashion. So there's a normative dimension that's missing from the construct. That means a proper part of any normative construct, a proper part of meaning is the aspiration to get more and better meaning in life. And that gets us a little bit clearer. And then as soon as we start to talk about that, we have to talk about another problem with the current construct. The current construct is a product theory. It just tells us what meaning looks like, a list of features, but it's not a process theory. It doesn't tell us how does how does meaning arise for people? How do they cultivate meaning? And more importantly, how does it function? How does it develop? How does it relate to other maturational processes? How does it relate to other important constructs like loneliness or mental health, in a causal fashion, not just a merely correlational fashion? So what this means is you have to broaden the question. You can't just sort of simply ask people, is your life meaningful? Because if people have friends and family, right, and they have some projects and they have a career, they'll say my life is okay, it's pretty meaningful. But if you ask them, yeah, but how's the world? Does the world
Hmm.
seem ordered and intelligible and beautiful? Is it affording you cultivation of wisdom and self-transcendence? You'll get, no, the world's filled with bullshit. And my life is one that vacillates between burnout and boredom in the face of that world. Right. And yet you see that, and now we're starting to get closer about what's going on. And you ask them, well, how much is your meaning in life shared with other people? It's like, well, I don't, but that's another thing that's really besetting us. Our meaning in life tends to be very isolated and individualistic, and that's very fraught with problems. And that overlaps with the next thing, which is, well, how much is your meaning in life aspirational? How much is it helping you cultivate wisdom? How much is your projects of wisdom helping you enhance meaning in life, like all the philosophical traditions talk about? And people will say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. And now we're getting closer to what I'm talking about with the meaning crisis. We're talking about the fact that the aspirational, developmental, normative, functional aspects of meaning in life, its connection to wisdom cultivation, its connection to, right, the amelioration of other related things like loneliness. It's the way in which it helps us socially coordinate with other people. That's what's at risk for people right now. That's the meaning in life that's at risk. And the idea is the reason that that's at risk is because the place in which we did all of those things in the integrated fashion, a normative, developmental, aspirational project of wisdom cultivation, reducing self-deception, creating shared, right, meaning in life, right? Doing this with a rich ecology of practices that give us multiple means of intervention and self-correction for our very complex, dynamic, individual and collective cognition. That was done in religion. And the West has largely secularized to varying degrees of analysis. And what means, and I'm not here to defend that Christianity or anything like that. My project is there was an enormous functionality around this deeper, more pronounced, and world encompassing sense of meaning that was lost when we lost religion. And so what we see is we see sort of different kinds of reaction. We see people merely suffering the loss, and we have loneliness problems. The number of close friends are going down. We have mental health. We have addiction issues. Then we have people who are doing this displacement. They take up pseudo-religious ideologies or pseudo-religious mythologies like the MC universe, and they get outraged if anybody transgresses upon that, and they go to conventions and they talk about it all day long, and they talk about these fictional characters, and they invest in them deeply. And then you have this intermediate category of people, the growing demographic of people who are spiritual but not religious. They distrust the world, they distrust the institutions, but they sense that they have to cultivate meaning and connectedness, but they want to do it on their own, and that's deeply problematic because your cognition doesn't work well autodidactically. All the evidence keeps mounting about that. And then finally, we have what you could call a healthy replacement response. We see the rise of Stoicism. Who would have thought that? The rise of the of the mindfulness revolution, the psychedelic renaissance. We see all of these things coming to the fore in a pronounced manner. Sorry, I had to give you a long answer because this
Wonderful.
standard way people think about this is actually part of the problem of the meaning crisis, right? Well, I've got friends and family. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what we're talking about here.
That's a really useful exposition. I want to go forward in time and also backwards in time. Perhaps it's better to go backwards first. So, well, a great deal of your first book is precisely about...
Thank you for the promotion. Yay!
No, look, I'm not. That's how we share thoughts apart from YouTube videos, right? That's the currency of thought in a way. I'm not promoting your work in this manner. You go back to the origins. So
yes.
But well, let me pose, because I do this, my thinking is maybe fragmented sometimes. Like, I'll pose the backwards and the forward question at the same time. So it seems like we did this secularization experiment, maybe not conscious, not willing, or maybe some people did it willingly, maybe as a counter reaction to what we had in the past. And we've run it for a few decades, maybe more than a century, and it's not working well. Now, what's the origin story of that? And at the same time, do you see this experiment as in some sort of evolutionary arc? And maybe that's speaking too much, like not only historically, but in terms of humans and the human condition. So on the one hand, this is what you're describing sounds like the kind of existential illness that we have as humans, like that, but there's something particularly wrong about it today. So where did it come from? And given that if we think of it as an experiment, if we learn from it and we awaken from the meaning crisis, would this be like something to celebrate, that we went through this failed experiment?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent question. So
there are two questions. Sorry, just
Yeah, no, I was treating the question as a bidirectional question,
Yes,
looking
it
back and
is.
looking forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me sort of address it that way. I mean, as Chris and I argue, Christopher Mastapietro and I'm in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the origins of the meaning crisis, and this isn't the only one that the West has had. There was another one during the Hellenistic period. Um, but the origins start to take shape sort of in the late medieval period, where a bunch of things emerge. You get a change in how people are reading, which tends to emphasize silent internal holding of statements or propositions, where before the reading was much more communal and much more transformative, and there was a much more embodied aspect and social aspect. So the reading shifts, and people start to understand uh, belief and faith as this internal holding of propositions and the willful assertion of them. And then you, of course, you have the late medieval crisis, with, of course, the Black Death and the two popes and all kinds of stuff happening, and there's a sort of a breakdown in the consensus about that model. And this idea of the holding of propositions and the chaos of the world gives rise to, the emergence of nominalism. It also emerges because of problems within Aristotelian ontology and epistemology. But this idea that the real patterns that we think are out there in the world, the categories and such, are actually in our mind, and we speak them into existence. And so we become very much like God, and it's an act of will on our
Mm.
part. And we start to shift from being participators in meaning to being makers of meaning. And that's a fundamental shift. And we get locked in to the coherence of our propositions. And now, because we're no longer participating in meaning, what we have is we have a correspondence model. Our minds have to be, the propositions have to be made coherent, and they have to correspond to the world. And so a gap starts to open up. And then the Protestant Reformation comes along and seriously challenges everything except the propositions, right? So you get sola scriptura, so the idea of the tradition and the living exemplars of the community of the saints, or the members of the church, or the priesthood, all of that falls into abeyance. You get the shutdown of the wisdom institutions, the monasteries. You get the severing of the university from the monastery. You get the beginning of the severing of the university from the church, and it starts to slowly gravitate towards the state. Um, and you get the separation of church and state with the Protestant Reformation. And then the scientific revolution comes along and makes a very radical proposal. It's confronting the massive anxiety of all of this. You see this especially in Descartes, and the problem with the nominalism, and it's saying, no, there is a language of reality. It's not just a human language in here, it's the language of reality, and that's math. And that's what Galileo said. Mathematics is the language of reality. And then math becomes the one tether point we have to reality. So we get locked into a very computational model. We're locked inside. All we can do is manipulate propositions mathematically, because that's the only way they will correspond to reality. And we get a very computational model, and we get locked and trapped inside. And then we get all of the problems that come with that, which is we are radically disconnected from reality. We come to entertain the thought, and it becomes culturally pervasive, that we have no knowledge of what reality is. Everything is just projected, except for the math, and then everything else gets reduced. So all of the non-mathematical, the beauty, you know, the sweetness, all of the experience of life gets shuffled into being purely subjective. All that's out there is valueless, mathematical. You get a fact value distinction. The values are all in here, but out there, there's just pure mathematical fact. And all of this stuff starts to cut us off. I don't know if you have a mind, because my mind is radically other than reality. And all I can see is your body. I have no access to your mind. There's no connection between my mind and body. There's no connection except this little thin computational reductionist thread between me and the world. And so I'm radically disconnected insofar as my lived experience matters to me and gives my life meaning and significance and purpose. All of that has nothing to do with reality. That is the situation. So what we live in is, think about what that means even now. Well, my life is meaningful, but it's a fragile meaning, because if you ask people to zoom out and consider the scientific worldview, they will feel radical that subjective meaning will be radically challenged and undermined, and they will feel cosmic insignificance. That's the prospect. That's the retrospective. The prospective is, I think we are coming to the collapse in cognitive science of that computational model. And I think that has a lot to do with 4E cognitive science and the work I do on relevance realization. We're giving up we're giving up all these dichotomies. They've all been undermined by rigorous analytic philosophy, fact, value, is, ought, theory, data, etc. History has undermined the fable that religion and science are intrinsic enemies and have always been so. All of that is collapsing. And we're coming to realize that, and to, Gleiser and Frank Gleiser? Is it Gleiser, Frank, and Thompson? Sorry,
Yes.
guys. Which
Yes.
way? Yeah. The blind
Yes.
spot. We're coming, and
Yes.
this is an argument convergent with mine, that we're coming to realize that if we don't reconnect our knowledge project to the foundations of our meaningful lived experience, we're actually in a performative contradiction. We're making statements that contradict the state from which we are making the statements. And that's a radical form of contradiction, even more radical than merely propositional contradiction. We're coming to realize that most of our knowing and our meaning is not held in our propositions and our beliefs, but in our skills, in our states of consciousness, in the traits of our characters. And so we're coming now out of that, but we're coming out of it in a way in which we are recapturing a lot of what we had in that previous Neoplatonic worldview, but it is now something that Neoplatonism has always actually been pretty good at. It is now being reintegrated with some of our very cutting edge cognitive science, biology, where something like a philosophical revolution is going on right now. And what I think is happening in physics, at least at the philosophical forefront, where it is trying to wrestle with some fundamental problems in its orientation and ontology. And so I think what we're going to have after we come out of this is better. Now, I don't know if there's an evolutionary teleology, but like Schellenberg, I do think we have to open up, right, the time scale at which we're evaluating our spirituality or religiosity, right? So here's a replica of the Lion Man from ancient Germany, certified replica. The original is 40,000 years old. And look at this. It was made out of mammoth tusk, right? Ivory. And it's got the body of a human being, the head of a lion, but the lion has a Mona Lisa enigmatic smile on it. And it has been rendered smooth by being passed between human beings for we don't know how long. So it was obviously part of ritual. There's something mythological. There's something symbolic going on here. That's 40,000 years. It's probably the evolutionary precursors probably go back even further. And then think about how far into the future our evolution could potentially go. And to believe that the sort of 3,000 years of the axial legacy religions got ultimate reality and got our right relationship to it pretty much correct. I agree with Schellenberg. I think that's a very questionable proposal. And I think we're opening up, because we're coming out the other side, to a new appreciation of what the sacred could mean for us and how it could play a role in alleviating that more fundamental meaning crisis I was talking about. Sorry, Àlex, I'm going to give you long answers because you ask these really profound questions.
Well, it's an easy job for me. I just listen and enjoy, and you do the hard work. All right. So it seems like this mutation is going to bring a new phenotype where the sage and the scientist can be reunited. Not to place too much emphasis on the science, because it's not, I don't think they're on the same level, but maybe, yes, to give this sense of, as you say, widening the time scale and perspective of, it's not just kind of misery and chaos now. Maybe it is, but just to think about where we're coming from very long in the past and where we're going. And this maybe produces a hint of a smile as you're saying all of this, like, all right, that looks like a great adventure. Actually, as you were describing it, I thought your second answer could have been like the proto script for a documentary like that, or a Netflix series, like how it all that happened. It's like a soap opera of humans in the last centuries. Okay, the third thing maybe now is there are many crises in the marketplace, the
Yes.
crisis this, the crisis that. And again, I'm not doing promotion, or I'm not saying yours is the real one and the other ones are fake, but help us sort out all this crisis talk and the actual kind of, the real meta meaning crisis and all the other kind of symptoms that maybe have a hint that something's going on, but that's focusing on them, perhaps it's not the way to get out the crisis.
So, yeah, first of all, I mean, we have to decide if we're talking everybody. Sorry, that's too strong. Many people admit there's a polycrisis. We have many different things that are at a global level of significance and have the capacity to, and to even more so in the future, inflict human suffering and loss. And then the meta crisis, which is something I agree with Daniel Schmachtenberger and others. He's been one of the clearest and most courageous advocates for the idea of the meta crisis, is that the polycrises, these separate crises around energy and economics and environment and political vacillation and instability and all of this stuff, and migration patterns, and they're all, and that's the idea. As soon as you say that, if you start to see them as interlocking and having, amplificatory effects, they amplify each other in very powerful ways. So there's the possibility of kind of a runaway effect between them. So I do think we're facing a meta crisis. And I think we have a general sort of semi-conscious cultural understanding of that, because our popular literature is filled with zombies and apocalypses. And that's, the zombies point to the meaning crisis, and the apocalypse point to the meta crisis, and they're locked together mythologically in people's minds. And what I have argued, and I continue to defend as a position, is that I think the relationship between the meaning crisis, the deeper version that I've been arguing for here, and the meta crisis is, if you get a meaning crisis, if you get meaning that is reduced, fragile, disconnected from wisdom, disconnected from shared cultural projects, then what you have is you actually have a scarcity for the functionality that religion performed. And when people are in scarcity mentality, we know this from the scarcity literature, they become very rigid in their problem-solving capacity. They become very reactive. They become very short-term, impulsive, very egocentric. And this is especially the case for meaning in life. I would propose as a form of scarcity. Again, the deeper notion that I'm arguing for here. So what I think happens is that that starvation for religious sapiential, having to do with wisdom, sapiential meaning in life, or spiritual religious sapiential meaning in life. And I'm just going to now bunch those all together and say the hunger for philosophical, in the ancient sense of philosophy, the hunger for philosophical meaning in life, I think starves us in a way that really disables us as we need to individually and collectively engage in the serious self-correction and self-transformation and problem solving, and those are all linked together, that are going to be needed in order to address the meta crisis. So that's how I think they're interconnected together.
Now that you mentioned problem solving, I remember at the beginning of your book with Christopher that there's this 9-dot
yes
test. It's so simple and so fascinating, and you use it to speak about these 3 types of knowledge that just mention the three types is already revealing, right? Propositional, and you spoke about kind of this addiction with propositional knowledge, and then procedural, that's good enough. But then there's a third one, right? Perspectival. Can you say more about this?
Well, actually, I've been arguing for four, and that shows up in the book as well. Working with Hussein and Daniel to get a paper published on this. So propositional knowing is what our culture is fixated on, and that's why our culture is rife with religious fervor around our ideological positions, because our holding and possession of propositions we take to completely define who and what we are, which is a radically scientifically, I think, indefensible position. I'm not saying your beliefs don't matter. Of course they do. But to claim that they are completely sufficient for explaining your cognition and your behavior, I think is radically incorrect. So, for example, most of your day-to-day knowing has to do with your procedural knowing how to do something. So propositional is like and then you state a proposition. I know that cats are mammals, and that's stored in semantic memory. Like, do you know that cats are mammals? Yes, I do. And you nod your head, and that's semantic memory. And you have a sense of conviction that it's real or true. But you have a different thing. You have procedural knowledge. You know how to swim. You know how to catch a ball. You know how to kiss somebody you love. Um, and that's not a belief. That's a skill. And skills aren't true or false. Is your swimming true or false? It doesn't make any sense. It's, does it apply or not? Does it have power or not over your environment? Right? It's a different sense of realness, and it's a totally different sense of memory. Procedural memory and semantic memory are dissociated from each other. You can have damage in one without damage the other, etc. But I notice that you're not swimming right now. And well, why not? Well, because you have consciousness, which means you have a situational awareness. You have a state of mind that sizes up the situation you're in and makes things salient and obvious and relevant to you. So you know what it's like to be you here now, and what's obvious, what should be foregrounded, what should be backgrounded. You have that. That's called perspectival knowing. And you know how to take perspectives. You even know how to take other people's perspectives. You know that you can run all your propositions correctly, but if you're egocentric in your perspective taking, you can still fall into all kinds of error. That's perspective knowing, perspectival knowing. It has a different kind of sense of realness. It's the sense of presence. When I'm separated from my beloved Sarah, right? I have all my propositions about her. I truly believe she's still alive. I have all my skills. Right. I know how to take care of things when she's away and keep the house in order for her and all that stuff. But I miss her because I miss her presence. I miss presence, and presence is another sense of realness, and it has another kind of memory associated with it, episodic memory. So unlike when I asked you, are cats mammals, if I asked you, like, what was it like when you showered this morning, if you showered, you go back and relive it. You go into and you make yourself present in your imagination to that perspective taking. And then below it is a largely unconscious but foundational kind of knowing, participatory knowing. This is the knowing that basically unconsciously turns space into place for you. Right? What it is that your body, your mind body, and the world are being governed by the same principles, patterns, and processes, right? And so what are called affordances are available to you. So this floor and I have both been created and manipulated and shaped by technology, culture, history, and physics. And because we participate in those same patterns, that floor is walkable for me. It affords walking. And so I get place. And that, right? And that has a sense of realness to it. Like when you have that nebulous sense that something's wrong because you're lonely or you're homesick or things don't feel right, right, in a situation. You get that loss of a sense of proper belonging. And it has its own unique kind of memory too, because it has to do with how your agency and how the world is an arena for your agency fit together. All the roles that become available for you. And your sense of memory for that is your sense of identity. And that impacts how you can know, because we know, even though we don't really acknowledge it sort of formally in our epistemology, that a lot of kinds of truths are not available to us unless we undergo a change in our participatory knowing, a fundamental change in our way of being in the world. We have to mature, for example. That's a change in your character. That's a change in your participatory knowing. And much of the connectedness and the self-correctedness that goes into meaning in the way I'm talking about it is below the propositional. It's in all these non-propositional. It's in your skills and your states of consciousness and mind and your character and your identity and your roles and your affordances.
And we stop cultivating those, right? That's why you speak about cultivating wisdom as opposed to, well, reading more and trying to be more able to juggle propositions, right? Which seems to be the Olympic sport in academia. But yes, please tell us about cultivation and practice. And one of the things that's, well, it's not unique of you. I don't want to exaggerate, but it defines the integration that you're proposing, because you embody it actually, is that you bring in not just talks and lectures and the teaching, which is, but the meditation, the contemplation, the practices, right? It's like without practices, it seems that all those levels remain, they need to mature, as you're saying, and without that, but it feels like, well, we only cultivate one part, and without that, we don't cultivate wisdom at all.
Yes. So another way of understanding the meaning crisis, and I'll do this with my students, I say, where do you go for information? And like the cyborgs we're becoming, they hold up their phones. And then when I say, where do you go for knowledge? They're sort of, bitten by postmodernism, and they're a little bit, well, I guess science, the university, history, but, and then they do all that. And then I say, where do you go for wisdom? And then there's a very anxious silence.
With what?
There's a
Yeah,
very
no,
anxious...
I mean, they would say with what, right?
Yeah,
Like...
well, no, I want to give them more credit. They have an intuition that there's something there. They have an intuition that there's a difference between ignorance and foolishness. There's a difference between a lack of theoretical knowledge and even of skill knowledge, and the overcoming of self-deception, which is at the heart of wisdom. They know that there's a difference there, but there's no place to educate the overcoming of self-deception. And they've been taught the only way you relate to propositions is one of information. Propositions are be consumed. The idea that propositions might be in the service of the transformation of non-propositional knowing, something that has been at the heart of our religious traditions, is not apparent to them. It's not something that can come up for their consideration. As soon as I propose it to them, they're very excited about it, almost universally. They're like, what? Tell me more about this. Tell me more about overcoming foolishness. Tell me more about transformative texts that help me cultivate new skills, new states of consciousness, new traits of character, and do it in a way that gives me a deeper sense of a deeper kind of meaning. They are hungry for that. And what they often say to me, both when I introduce this as a theoretical proposal and when I make good on it by teaching them various kinds of practices, they will say things like, this is something I was always looking for, but didn't realize I was looking for it.
And then?
Well, then what happens is they very frequently, they will take up some, many of them go into the kind of cognitive science that I've been advocating, and they take up these topics. Many of them take up rituals. Rituals are transformative practices that concentrate on non-propositional knowing, and the goal is not the production of new knowledge, but the cultivation of ongoing wisdom. And so many of them take up rituals, and you have to do it plural, and you have to do it with other people. This is what's wrong with spiritual but not religious. We can get in it for technical reasons having to do with relevance realization and things like that. There is no panacea practice. There is no single practice. There's things like the no free lunch theorem. There's no panacea practice that can universally ameliorate your self-deception. And also you have self-deception at all these levels: propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory. So you need an ecology, you need a whole set of dynamically interconnected, counterbalancing, right, practices that are transformative. There are rituals, and you need to share, at least sometimes be sharing them with others, because our individual self-correction is quite poor. Our collective self-correction is quite good. It's not perfect. It is also not a panacea. And so many of them take up ecologies of ritual, both individual and collectively.
What's the promise here? What's going to get better? Are we going to be happier, have more meaning, be wiser? What's the thing that's going to increase? Because I suppose those things are not the same. And sometimes the happiness talk sounds, I mean, who doesn't want to be happy, but sounds naive. But then if you imagine being wiser, what does that mean? Like becoming wiser? What's the thing you're trying to maximize or cultivate? It's a more ecological word, actually.
Well, I want to first magnify that your first point, because I think it's a very good point. Our culture confuses and conflates multiple things together. It confuses wealth with subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is I feel really good about who I am in my life, and the thing is increases in wealth, and so this is increases in wealth, and this is increases in subjective well-being. Initially, increases of wealth massively increase subjective well-being because you're getting out of poverty, you're getting out of scarcity. But once you're fully, securely beyond scarcity, you have to do titanic increases in wealth to make very small increases in subjective well-being. So massive wealth pursuit is actually fundamentally irrational. And then we confuse subjective well-being with meaning in life, and the standard isolated internal version that I'm sort of criticizing. But even that, think about having a child. Your subjective well-being crashes. You're not sleeping, you're not eating, there's an alarm bell, the kid crying, and you're evolutionary programmed to stress when that goes off. Your partner, who you thought loved you the most, doesn't like you anymore. Your finances are crippled, and you're getting sick all the time. Well, why do you have a kid? Because you have more meaning in life, right? You're connected to something outside of your egocentric subjective well-being. But why is that not enough? Why are people so frustrated and angry? Because that meaning in life isn't the same thing as this full-blown philosophical meaning that our culture is so impoverished. I think that happiness, right, is about all of them. And we should stop trying to come up with a single account. I think the Epicureans are right. I think we need meaningful pleasure, subjective well-being. Meaningful pleasure, by the way. I think the Stoics are right. We need inner peace and a connectedness to what's real, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should be thinking about, do people have meaningful pleasure, subjective well-being? Yeah. Do they have standard psychological meaning in life? Yes. Do they have philosophical meaning in life? Then and do they feel that that is a developmental progression in their life? Then I think we could start to talk about it being happy. The Greeks had a great line: don't call anybody happy until they're dead, because you don't know if they're happy, because it's this lifelong development of the intertwining of all of these variables.
This is a segue, because I wanted to ask you about religions, and in particular about Buddhism, and what's so special when it comes to the relationship between Buddhism and cognitive science, and that's part of the enactivist camp. And I know you're deeply embedded there, so there's something beautiful. So maybe you can explain what happened, and at the same time, because it seems like my questions are double, to compare it to Christianity, for instance, right?
Sure.
And also, as you were talking about well-being and happiness and so on, I'm reading lately like the lives of some saints, and they're kind of the top practitioners, if you wish, of that game, and I say it in a good spirit, but their lives seem terribly miserable sometimes. So I'm asking also for a comparison. Perhaps I'm biased, of course. I'm born in Spain, so my country is a Catholic country. I was raised Catholic, and so I want to understand why Buddhism just seem to work so well with this new understanding that cognitive science is bringing. And what about Christianity then? And maybe if you want to comment on other spiritual and
Sure.
religious practices.
This is a very this is an excellent question, and it has also a personal relevance to me. And I think I've seen it in other people shifting within cognitive science between sort of a focus on Buddhism towards a focus, maybe not on Christianity, but on the Neoplatonic tradition that runs through the mystical aspects of Christianity, Sufism, Kabbalah, the Renaissance, and things like that. You can even see it in the American Transcendentalists. So I think initially, and this is the case for me, there was a need. I have to be careful because it's hard for me to pull apart, I should say, my personal trauma from being brought up in fundamentalist Christianity and the general cultural malaise about a distrust in institutionalized Christianity, which is still on the increase, and it is now on the increase even in the United States significantly, which had been a resistor to that worldwide trend. So I'm asking for some leeway on that. I can't totally I've done therapy and I do other things, and I want to be honest with people that that's where I'm coming from. So initially, I needed to leave Christianity, and I think a lot of people need that, and they need to leave it because of criticism of the institutions, trauma by individuals or the institutions, a problem about the history of the institutions, things like that, and for all of its negative connotations, Buddhism is the other. It's the Eastern, and it seems to have some things like it. Like it talks a lot about compassion, and that was sort of the good part. Agape and Karuna are very similar in some ways, and it puts an emphasis back on the non-propositional, which was the corrective that was needed. There's an enormous preference given to attention and awareness and transformation and the non-propositional. This is at the heart of Zen. I mean, the whole point of the koan is to make propositional knowing self-destruct, so the non-propositional kinds of knowing become open and available for radical transformation, right?
Yes.
And so that is just pronounced and profound, and it gives you an ecology of practices, an ecology of rituals that are understood to be an ecology, the Eightfold Path, represented by an eight-spoked wheel, because they're all interweaving and they all dynamically revolve and evolve. And that's very powerful. And you have a less, at least initially, less obvious commitment to a two worlds mythology, a bifurcation of the world into the natural and the supernatural, which is another part of the problem with the meaning crisis. And so Buddhism looks really good, but there's a lot of people, myself included, Stephen Batchelor, my friend Evan Thompson, and others that went into Buddhism and have come out of it and have become equally critical of Buddhism because of the fact that it also has problematic aspects in it that are difficult to reconcile with important ideas about cognitive science and history and
That's very
biological
interesting.
evolution.
That's very interesting, like that life histories of individuals as well, coming in and out. Maybe one more question on this, and then I want to talk briefly about AI and be mindful of the time, and also ask you about ontology. But so when it comes to the West, and again, hopefully people from all around the world could be watching it. And I don't mean in terms of numbers. I mean, again, I speak like a European now. I sometimes wonder if the Eastern mind can be copied and pasted here, right? There's this sense of universality, which I think is something that also as a theoretical physicist I've been stamped on, but maybe not, because we speak about, and you also speak and write about ways of knowing, and in the Paris Center, we often speak about indigenous ways of knowledge and of knowing, and indigenous means from the place. So I sometimes wonder if this, well, it's not a flirting, because I don't want to be, flippant about it, but this, okay, let's do mindfulness from 6 to 8 on Tuesdays and Thursdays and burn incense, but we don't want to know anything about our Western saints and so on. Well, is this even possible, given that people in the East seem to have, I mean, we're all humans, of course, but it's another kind of maybe structure, cognitive structure of being, and why aren't we trying to, again, apologies, in the case of the West, trying to recuperate what's indigenous of the West, and in the East, what's indigenous there, and in the Americas, and so on?
Well, I think we are, which was the other thing I alluded to. I think what's happening and coming more and more into prominence, it's at the center of my work right now, is the recovery of the Neoplatonism, which I think Arthur Verse Lewis is right about, is the spiritual backbone of the West.
Yes,
And
yes.
Neoplatonism gave us an entire set of uh, meditative, contemplative, reflective, dialogical, imaginal practices and rituals. It gave us a rich ontology in which, and this ontology is becoming plausible again. We are giving up because we're trying to get out of the blind spot. We're giving up a flat, single level ontology. We're getting out. We're coming to understand that performative contradiction is just as important as propositional contradiction. We have to pay attention to what is presupposed to do our science, not just what is derived from the propositions of our science. All of this is coming out, and all of this is giving, right. So this is giving us the idea of something much more like the Neoplatonic world, in which there's causal emergence up, real causal emergence, and real emanation of constraints down. And here I'm invoking the tremendously important work of Alicia Guerrero and others. And then because of the breakdown of all these dichotomies, the subject object, fact value, is ought, right, inner outer, mind body, right, that whole representational model is collapsing. The 4E cog sci is no, we are coupled to reality. We have a participatory relation. Now, if you have participatory knowing, especially non-propositional participatory knowing, in which transformation is central, and it is coupled to a reality that isn't flat, but, and this is only a metaphor, has a vertical dimension to it, not just temporally historical, but vertical ontological. You have Neoplatonism. That's Neoplatonism. Those are the core pieces of Neoplatonism. And then you have a rich philosophical, mystical practice tradition that is available to us and that people are starting to recover. And mystical Christianity is on the rise. And the forms of Christianity in which Neoplatonism and ritual are more pronounced, like Eastern Orthodoxy, are going through an unexpected increase and boom. And who would have been able to see that 10 years ago even? So Neoplatonism, which I think is the indigenous Western backbone spirituality, is going through a significant revival, and I think it is coming more and more into a clear convergence with 4E cognitive science. I'm advocating for it and arguing for it, so I'm biased, but I'm clearly not a single individual about this. When I present this proposal, both to Platonists and cognitive scientists, they light up, they like it, they think there's something deep going on here. And there's convergent books, the masterful book by Pickstock, Catherine Pickstock, on aspects of truth is just very convergent with it, and it's astonishingly brilliant. And I can do more. The people who are, all the people like Andropov and Radkowski and Capobianco and others who are saying that the late Heidegger is actually a Neoplatonist, although he doesn't understand or realize that he is, because he's deeply misread Plato. All of this is happening profoundly right now. This is part of what I'm trying to articulate with the advent of the sacred. And I think there is deep, I want to be really careful here. I'm a pluralist, which means I think there are universal processes, universal functions, right, across these traditions, but there is a heterogeneity of products, like biological evolution. Biological evolution is creating adaptivity. That's our fittedness to the environment. It's a universal process, but that doesn't mean it produces homogeneous products. In fact, it predicts exactly the opposite, an ongoing, uncountable variation from this universal process of, right, a heterogeneity of products. And what that means is we have to understand we have universals by which we can deeply talk to each other, but we don't have absolutes that will allow us to be imperialistically trying to reduce everybody else to us.
Are you a pluralist also in an ontological sense when it comes to philosophy? Or another way of saying it, what's your ism? What is it? Is it dual aspect monism? Is it idealism? In what form? Also, let me add here, I used to be an activist, if I were lucky then, and then I stopped being one. I think I had an activist crisis because I was trying to figure out what's their metaphysics, and they, of course, I love phenomenology, but it's like, no, we don't want to talk about that as if that didn't exist and it was even a bad idea to just go there. So that's why I describe sometimes it feels like trapped in between the first and the second floor in an elevator. Like you're not really sure whether you're doing science, philosophy, or neither. But I'm really interested in what's the ism that so far frames all of these that we're talking about for you?
Well, I'll tell you in a sec, but I want to first say I think that attitude in phenomenology inherited from Heidegger of, and I'm trying to find the quote, and I found it, I've read it in a couple places. The one thing that holds postmodernism together is the claim that Plato is the villain. Right? And this is from Heidegger. And this is just fundamentally wrong. All the scholarship is just demolishing that, which means the way phenomenology and postmodernism inherited that fundamental misreading of Plato has to be abandoned. And and as I've just argued, I think that there is this amazing confluence between phenomenology and 4E cog sci happening right now, and Neoplatonism. John Rusin is, a prototypical example, but there are many people doing this. And so I think there is a deep ontology. And so I describe myself as a Zen Neoplatonist. That's where I am.
Could you say a bit more about how this relates to other isms? And there seems to be a war of the isms, like because physicalism is crumbling, or I would say it's dead, or it's in this terminal lucidity phase. And so it's like the market is kind of open again, and everybody's coming with their favorite one, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, maybe we should constellate them and see. That's why I was asking if you're a pluralist in that sense too, to kind of appreciate, incorporate the good that's in every ism without trying to have like one winner. And I don't want to be a relativist here either.
No, I'm not. I said there are universals. There are universals of process, function, and development, and they mean that that it's clearly the case that all the isms cannot possibly be equal because there are normative differences, because there are universals, right, that allow us to say no, this isn't as good as that because that's violating, right, that's increasing self-deception because these processes of self-deception are universal. So that's how a pluralist is radically different from a relativist. The terms are sometimes used interchangeably, and that's stupid because we need the distinction, and we have a distinction, so let's keep the distinction because it's a valuable and important one. Neoplatonism basically it takes very, very seriously causal emergence, constraint emanation, a vertical dynamical complexity, as well as a horizontal developmental complexification. All of that is the case. A deep continuity, to use Evan's important idea, between cognition, biology, and ontology. That's also a Neoplatonic idea through and through. It's not just a return to Neoplatonism, of course, because there's aspects of Neoplatonism that seem to reject embodiment, and I think those are flawed. The point about the Zen, and Zen does not have to be attached to Buddhism, and this is not some neo-syncretism on my part. There has been a decades-old project of Zen Catholicism and Zen Christianity. There is the Kyoto school bridging between the implicit Neoplatonism of Heidegger and Zen Buddhism. So this is not something I'm introducing. This has been going on. What I'm arguing for is we need an ecology of traditions, just like we need an ecology of rituals. Because they have universals, they can deeply talk to each other, and they can mutually transform each other. But because they are not homogeneous, we should not expect a monolithic institution or monoculture of spirituality. We have to get a dialogical. That's what my Philosophical Silk Road project is actually all about.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, I'll trade the AI question for another one, and then I'll open it up for Q&A and comments from our dear audience. I remember when we met in Scotland, I remember vividly when we were having dinner and also when we were having breakfast, and you were telling me about transcendent versus transcendental. And I think that
Yes.
can really help us with our chiropractices of science, the sacred, and so on. Going beyond, but in what sense? Yeah, help us understand that.
So I think, again, these terms are used interchangeably. They shouldn't. But there is confusion because there's a pre-Kantian and post-Kantian use of the word transcendental. I recommend using the Kantian tradition because that's the one that's more now pronounced in our culture and and in academia. So transcendental means the conditions for the possibility of knowing. It has very much to do with like the ground of cognitive agency. So using another tradition that means a lot to me, it's sort of like pointing towards Atman, right? The ground of cognitive agency, right? Not your ego, but that which makes your ego and your thoughts and your memories and your cognition possible. I think that has a lot to do with relevance realization, but that's another conversation. Hopefully I'll be able to talk about it when I'm in Pari.
Yes.
And then transcendent has to do with the ground of being. And this is, of course, comes from Heidegger's famous critique of ontotheology, that the ground of that being, capital B, the ground of being is not a being, not any particular being, because it can't explain the differences between beings, and it can't explain the field of beings. This is why God, if you understand God to mean something like the ground of being, can't be a being, and therefore God can't be a substance in the Aristotelian sense, or an agent, or a person, because those are beings. And being is not sort of the property shared in common by all the beings. It's something more profound, and this is why it's often described as no thingness. And then what you have is that the transcendent ground, is no thingness in this ontological sense. And then if I get you to do the following, a lot of mystical practices do this kind of thing. Okay, so you're aware of like the room, and then step back and look at your framing of the room, right? And you can step back and step back. You can do that stepping back thing, right? In your perspective taking. And what you realize is how you can become aware of how you're framing reality, but I can only do that by moving back to it by a bigger, more encompassing framing, right? And that framing is not in my awareness because it's making my awareness possible. Oh, well, I want to be aware of that. And I can zoom out, and then I can be from a more encompassed framing. But what I can never get is the most encompassing framing that makes all awareness possible. It's a no thingness. James talked about the distinction between the I and the me, but it's like your eye. You see from it, you don't see it, right? And so there's a no thingness at the ground, a transcendental no thingness, and then there's an ontological transcendent no thingness, and then phenomenologically they seem interpenetrating and indistinguishable. And then from many convergent traditions, there's the idea, like in Neoplatonism, about realness is dependent on intelligibility. And intelligibility is the idea that cognition, being known, and reality, being, they have to share the same principles, because if they don't share the same principles, same patterns, and same processes, you're back to that radically dichotomous problem that would actually, if we were being completely performatively consistent, would give us complete skepticism, complete solipsism, complete egocentrism, complete trapped in the present moment. I can't possibly even know if my past self exists. All that, which is just disastrous. So I call this the primordial symbolon. I don't use the word symbol because we've trivialized that in English. The symbolon in Greek was the joining together of two. The transcendental ground of cognition and the transcendent ground of being are phenomenologically interpenetrating, and I would just say cognitively, epistemologically, completely interdependent. They have a participatory relation. And That is a fundamental presupposition. I can't prove that to you because any attempt to prove it requires that phenomenological experience and that presupposition that that my knowing actually participates in reality.
It's beautiful. It's like an encounter at the ultimate possible level of reality, true encounter, true participation there as well.
And I would propose to you that, and I'm going to use the great Canadian atheist Schellingberg's proposal of the triple transcendent as a way of describing the sacred. This is an ultimate reality within and without, so it's transcendent in that way. I'm saying it's transcendental transcendent. It's ultimately transformative because to go there is to radically undermine your egocentric way of understanding yourself, your understanding of the world of made up of separate individual things. It's radically transformative and it's radically reorienting because it calls you towards the really real, which is profoundly intrinsically important to you. I put it to you that that's a great definition of the sacred, that which is ultimately real, ultimately transformative, and ultimately orienting or reorienting. And so this relationship to what I'm talking about is not merely a scientific relationship or an intellectual relationship, because it's properly transformative and because it puts us in relationship to the sacred, it is properly a spiritual religious relationship.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I think now it's time to open it up for our audience and see what they have to say. So, are you there, Michael? Can you help me with the...
Yes, I
Thank
am
you.
actually. Yes, Veronica, if you could jump in, I will spotlight you. And
okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vervaeke. I'm a long-time follower of yours.
Oh, thank you.
Can you hear? Can you hear her well? We can hear you very well.
I can't hear her very well either. I just turned up my speakers, but
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Maybe.
little bit better.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, I'm a long-time follower of your work, and my question is, you mentioned Stoicism at the very beginning, and my question is, don't you think that in view of science and spirituality, a lot of scientists seem to tend toward idealism? So don't you think we're going to go straight from physicalism of materialism to an idealism that is not going to help very much?
So I take very seriously what you're saying. I think there's a bifurcation, and I think one of the bifurcations about the collapse of physicalism is to one of the channels is towards idealism. Another one is towards panpsychism, which is also gaining a lot of traction. And I'm good friends with Phil Goff. And then the other one is this resurgence of Neoplatonism. And we have to remember that Neoplatonism played a significant role in both the first scientific revolution and the Einsteinian scientific revolution. Einstein was a direct and explicit follower of Spinoza, and Spinoza is directly within the Neoplatonic tradition. And things similar to Neoplatonism, like Vedanta, have a huge impact on Heisenberg and people. I won't go on. So I think all three of these options are on the table right now. I don't sense any clear forerunner right now. And I agree with you. It is possible we could go down idealism. It is possible we can go down panpsychism. I'm arguing against those two, and I'm arguing for the Neoplatonic because I think it is much more consonant with our scientific endeavors and with our history and with our spiritual situation.
great. Thanks so much, John, and thanks again, Veronica.
And by the way,
well.
Michael, just a second. That's so relevant to what we're going to do next week when we're going to have this conversation between Bernardo Kastrup and Rupert Sheldrake, and it's entitled,
yes.
Is Idealism Enough? And of course, I think we're all within the camp of physicalism is over, but now if it's over, then what's next, right? So I'll bring you this comment back when we're having that conversation next week. Thank you.
Well, Alex, I've on Kurt Jamango's Theory of Everything. I have, I think it's 3 conversations with Bernardo. I have tremendous respect for Bernardo. I think if I was to be an idealist, it would be an idealist the way Bernardo is. I still fundamentally disagree with him. I think the kind of Neoplatonic model I'm pointing to is much better at the data. He argues for parsimony. I have a much more pragmatic notion of parsimony than he does. And so it gets into that very kind of nitty-gritty philosophical difference.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. All right.
Okay.
Enjoyable.
Great dovetail into our upcoming events here. Yes, Yasmine, if you would like to jump in, I will spotlight you.
Thank you. So hi, thank you so much. This was really mind-blowing.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a very simple question and very confused at the same time. So let me make sure that I'm being understood here. I'm really not a student of philosophy, especially, and so I'm just gonna use very simple terms that come from my, thank you, from my own experience. So let me see. I have a sense, so listening to this, which is really so interesting, but I have a sense of malaise, maybe, or uneasiness about a kind of like, so the way I've been going about it is that starting with Sufism and then, you know, going on to different things. And I'm partial to Taoism right now. Like you can have like all kinds of little loves and things, but I have a something that I call shopping for cosmologies. Or you know, and I'm uneasy about it because it seems to me like mostly it comes from here. And how about dealing with the meta crisis, dealing with a crisis that seems to be bigger, and I mean bigger is just, you know, that is not, that we can, that seems to be without precedent. Let's put it that way. Although I never like to say that, but let's say that. It seems to me like, how does, aesthetically speaking, it's a problem for me to go back, to return to something that was, quote unquote, like emerged before our time. And I'm starting to wonder about the emergence of a new spirituality. And it seems to me like that would aesthetically please me more. It's really a question of, it would be more consistent. I wonder if you have something to say about that, because I love all those other traditions, absolutely adore them, but there is that question. So that's
Thank you, Yasmine. That's a very pertinent, and you're giving me a chance to correct a misrepresentation I might have presented to all of you. I have requested to be put on my tombstone neither nostalgia nor utopia. I don't want to go back, and I don't believe in Promethean utopians. They have drenched the world in blood, and we know what. So my philosophical Silk Road project is to create this deeply transformative dialogue. In fact, I often use the Greek word because dialogue is too weak. I use a dialogos as in order for this deeply mutually transformative thing, like what Socrates did with people between these traditions, in order to make us properly receptive to the advent of the sacred, what I'm talking about, the possibility of the sacred being born in a new way for us, which I think is the world side of the solution, the Weltgeist, to use a Hegelian term, to the meaning crisis. So I'm very much in alignment with what you're talking about. I'm not sure I'm in alignment with the shopping for cosmologies. Or maybe you were being critical or satirical about that. I do think there's a universal aspect. I do think that our cognition is shaped profoundly by its coupling and participation in the world, and that shaping of our cognition puts serious constraints on what can count as our cosmology. And so, and that's how I'm not a relativist. In that way, I think I'm like very convergent with your second point, which seemed to be your more prominent point. And I have a little bit, I don't know if it's disagreement or not with because like I say, I'm a proper pluralist. I do think that there is, and I do think there is something like the long-term evolution of spirituality. that has occurred. And we are facing something in some ways unprecedented, but not. We've had complete civilizational collapse before, the Bronze Age collapse, and we've had a complete civilizational-wide meaning crisis, the Hellenistic period, after the collapse of Alexander's empire. So although not exactly, they have been very global and comprehensive and devastating in nature.
Okay,
Great.
thank you. Thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Thank
Really,
you both
really,
so much.
yeah, I really applaud your answer, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Excellent. Yes. Now, Naresh disappeared for a bit and then he came back. So after Naresh, we'll go to the regular queue and Hugh. But Naresh, if you'd like to jump in, I saw that your hand was raised earlier and then you disappeared for a bit. So
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, John. I'm asking a question of clarification. You
Sure.
seem to be critical of people who claim to be spiritual but not religious.
I'm
But
sympathetic. I
then,
want to be clear. I am sympathetic. I understand why. I distrust the institutions too.
okay,
I don't want to come off
exactly.
as coarse. I don't want to come off as coarse. So I sorry. I wanted to interrupt because I want to make clear the intent of my criticism. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, that sort of answers it almost, because later in your argument, everything that you say, from Neoplatonism, and drawing from bringing the convergence between the mystical dimensions of Christianity, Sufism part of Islam,
Yeah.
Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism, and the convergence, one might argue, that Àlex was talking about between the saint or the sage and the scientist, all argue for this more spiritual side that we all talk about. See, when I came to spirituality, I followed the path of trying to find out who am I. I had no religion involved in it. It was a pure individual experiment of trying to find out not only who am I, but what am I? And that, of course, as you know from meditative practices, you eliminate what you are not. It's much easier to say what you are not or to see yourself in layers. But ultimately, who are we or what are we? That investigation leads us to concessionary language, pure awareness, pure consciousness, and so on. So, and if you look at the mystical side of Christianity, the desert fathers and the Trappist monks and so on, they all come to the base contemplative prayer and so on that has little to do with the Gospels of Christianity, one might argue. So I see a very strong base for spirituality without religion, because I was afraid that your recommendation will then be that in order to find meaning again in life and in the world, one needs to revert to institutionalized religion, and that would worry me.
So let me try and respond to that carefully. First of all, as I said, that's why I interrupted. I'm very sympathetic with people's distrust of the institution. I did caveat that at the beginning and say there's a lot of reasons why, justifiable reasons why people reject the institutions. I want to point out to you that that institutional distrust is not limited to religious institutions. It is culturally comprehensive right now. The distrust for almost all the institutions, the legal institution, political institution, economic institution, and now the scientific institution is rising rapidly. And so when you do sort of scientific investigation, so it's a more pervasive distrust. It doesn't seem to be specific to religious institutions. Secondly, there's two things. I understand, and you understand, I think, that I'm making a probabilistic argument. I'm not saying that individuals can't do this. I'm saying the probability of them doing it poorly is greater when they do it in isolation. For example, you did not come up with the meditative practices you used. They were put through time-tested many generations of tradition shared between people to get it to a place where it was usable by you. You're relying on distributed cognition. You're relying on a collectivity. The Desert Fathers, and we could have an argument about the degree to which they were, dependent on the Gospels, and that could be its own thing. And then I put that together with the fact that, and you can even see this intuitively, although everything I'm saying is backed up with well-replicated experimental research. It's very hard for you to catch your own biases. It's really hard. It's metabolically measurably hard for me, to pick up on our biases. It's metabolically easy for us to pick up on other people's biases. That's how we evolved. And this is in the Socratic tradition of self-knowledge, know thyself. I'm your best chance at self-correction, and you're my best chance at self-correction. Cognition is dialogical in nature. It's not monological. And so the fact that we are cryptically relying on distributed cognition and institutional traditions for the practices, and the fact that we should make use of dialogical means of self-correction, that's the basis for my criticism. I don't know you. You could be an exceptional human being. And you have to understand, when I'm speaking scientifically, I can't speak to individual differences. That's one of the problems of scientific discourse. We can all find people who have smoked until they're 80 and never got lung cancer, things like that. So I was very careful to speak at that level. And I don't want to convey two things. I don't want to convey a coarseness towards people who are distrustful of the institutions. I am too, deeply, traumatically, and I was honest about that. And secondly, I don't want to condemn any particular individual without getting to know them and see how their life is going. How could I possibly do that? I can only speak about a scientist, as a scientist about this, or a historian about groups and processes, etc.
Thank you, Naresh, and thank you, John. We have 3 more questions in the queue, so if we could keep our questions pointed and tight, in the last moments, we'll try and get through everyone. Hugh, you're next. If you join us, I will spotlight you. Whoops, wrong person. Whoops, no, right person.
Wrong person?
No.
Good. No, you're good.
Are there 2 Hughs?
You're good to go, Hugh. You're welcome.
All right. I'm sorry.
That proves it's live.
Yeah, I've proved it. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to throw it out of the door.
Technology is the god.
Oh, wow. Throwing the phone. That's...
Yeah, I wanted to be sure, John, that we didn't close with a sense of the one who knows. You don't have knowing without one who knows.
Sure.
And that our subject for being here today is the future. Have I remembered it right? The future of the world?
Yes.
The future world.
Right. So the future of the world, as you spoke of it, John, how is it affecting you? I have no sense at the moment of how all of this is actually affecting you. I would be very grateful if you would speak to that for a little while.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugh. I mean, I'm reticent as a Canadian to make myself the center stage. And I was also brought up in a very punitive form of Protestantism, which also, really dissuades
Wow.
that. But so thank you for the opportunity and the permission. I'll take it as permission.
Yeah, please, an encouragement, I would say.
Thank you. I want to now shift and say my relationship to the philosophical Silk Road that I've been talking about here is not a project. It is a pilgrimage. I feel profoundly called to this. I feel a tremendous sense of calling. If I just said that without your permission and without the context of everything that's gone on before, that would come off as loony. So I'm taking it again that the context you've afforded me. So thank you. For me, I have committed myself. I'm going to go to different places in the world and actually interact with people there and with sage figures like Dionysus or Maximus or Shankara or Nishitani. And I have committed myself to like a pilgrimage. I don't know how it's going to change me. I'm vulnerable and open. So whatever I happen to teach theoretically in a lecture series that will accompany the movie, the undergoing that I will undergo is the proper subject of the film, the movie, of the philosophical Silk Road, because I there is nothing else unless I put myself at risk in this. I do not feel I would be authentically responding to how I feel called to do this project. So for me, if you'll allow me in a non-pretentious sense, there is in that sense a prophetic aspect. Not that I'm foretelling the future, but I'm being called by something beyond me by something that's implicit and imminent and is eminent in a way that I don't fully understand. And my appropriate response is a reverential commitment to put myself as much as possible and my resources and the people who are willing to accompany me on this journey in the service of this. Because this is another form of self-criticism. I used to talk about a religion that's not a religion as a solution to all of this. And then I realized I was falling prey to the very thing I was criticizing. I was trying to take an engineering approach to this. And the sacred, the sacred is like those living conversations that you have that take on a life of their own that you didn't expect and take you beyond where you thought you would end up. And both people know they couldn't get there on their own and they could not manufacture. You can only prepare for this. You can't manufacture it. And so I had to just abandon that whole hubristic engineering, and I mean no slight against engineer, but that hubristic engineering attitude and say, no, no, no. All I can do is properly prepare, and I have to let the sacred, take its own shape, because there is nothing else that would feel virtuous from me. That's how I'm showing up about this. You're muted, Hugh.
Great. John, do you have time for one more question?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Joshua, if you'd like to jump in, I know you're having trouble finding the reaction button earlier.
I got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Are you able to hear me? John, thank you. I'm a huge fan of yours. I've followed you probably the last 3 or 4 years. I'm curious if you've looked at the work of Brooke Holmes, who is a Princeton scholar. Primarily, she focuses on Homer, and specifically the period of the late 5th century, early 4th century BCE. In her book, she really focuses on the Greeks' concept of the soma. And the soma, ultimately, she's trying to revivify this concept of the soma, to extract it from the dualism of mind and body, especially in regards to the psyche. And she's trying to give a little bit more life, in a sense, to what the soma was for the Greeks. And I think if you haven't read her, I think you'd find her really interesting, because what you're describing, if I can find the term, as a participatory knowing, that's what she's describing in terms of the Homeric apparatus and the way that the sort of an indoctrination of the Greeks through this participatory choreography of the epic form. And if I can, I'll just read this really quick excerpt that she says. The idea.
Can you give me the title of the book you're quoting?
Yeah, it's called "The Symptom and the Subject: The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece." I'm bringing it up because I'm a Chinese medical practitioner. I'm an acupuncturist.
I'm a professionally trained shiatsu therapist.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's the Chinese have very different view of the body than we do.
Yep.
And from my experience being in the field, working with people's bodies, what I've noticed is there seems to be a stark disconnect that people have to, for lack of a better word, the somatic aspect of their body. The other, and I've just been playing with this because it's what I've observed, like working in medicine, that they're sort of stuck in what I'd call the psyche, which in Chinese medicine, there's always this emphasis on interior and exterior, right? And the harmony of the interior and the exterior and how we're relating to the world around us. In Chinese medicine, a person can sort of be closed off from the surface of their body to the participatory knowing. I bring it up because what Brooke Holmes discusses in her book in terms of the soma is very close to what you're describing, this participatory knowing, but also in regards to, in a larger sense, what I think people are sort of lacking in terms of this harmony with their environment. If I can really quickly read this excerpt from The Symptom and the Subject, she's talking about how heroes show up in battle in Homer. She says, the idea of publicly staged arete requires some modification of the binary felt seen model. Up to now, I have focused on how demonic presence is felt from within, yet the presence often registers in a shared perceptual field. Surges of menos, for example, not only are subjectively sensed, but also transform how the warrior appears to others. Hector rages across the battlefield with the eyes of a Goron or man-destroying Ares. Elsewhere, his eyes glitter and he foams at the lips. Achilles, his eyes glowing, gnashes his teeth in his murderous rage. The very strangeness of this phenomenon is gauged against how these characters normally appear, that is, against a public scene identity. What I have been calling the scene then encompasses not only the skin that can be penetrated, but also skin understood as a visible surface rich in information about character, mood, and intentions. Whereas a warrior scanning the skin for points amenable to the spear views his opponent simply as a penetrable object, the Achaeans thrusting their spear into Hector's corpse are noticing too his breeding and his heroic appearance. So basically what she's saying is that the Iliad, epic consciousness, epic poetry, was sort of reveling in what you're describing, like this sort of constant participatory experience. And if you look at like scholars like Bruno Snell, what he's saying is like the Greeks really glorified agility, a body that is in constant motion. And when you're in constant motion, you can't have self-reflection. And I'm bringing it up because as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, basically what I'm seeing, what Chinese medical practitioners are trained to feel in the pulse is the mirror of the climatic of the cosmos as appearing as mirroring upon the surface of the human body. And so in all of what we're talking about, I'm thinking about where is the body here, and what aspect, what part of the body is really being elevated here. And there's, and this is the last I'll say of it, in the Chinese medical tradition, there is precedent for an identical sort of participatory knowing that Brooke Holmes describes in her Symptom and the Subject, and that is called the Shanghanlun, or the school of cold damage. And the primary focus of Chinese medicine, the foundational aspect of Chinese medicine, is honing into the surface of the body, wherein the way that the human body participates with the environment. It's the primary focus. And if you cannot, if you're
Yes,
not
Josh.
participating, yeah.
Yes, we're running short on time,
Sorry,
actually.
that was
No,
it.
no worries.
Yeah,
And
so I was
I'd
just
like
curious
to
if you
have some
studied
space
for
for
it.
John to respond to your intimations. So, John.
So first of all, I'm not aware of her work. I'm aware of similar work. Dreyfus Kelly, All Things Shining, made a similar argument. And you probably know about Herbert Dreyfus. Herbert Dreyfus is one of the main godfathers of 4E Cog Sci. The first E in 4E Cog Sci is embodiment, that the body is not a Cartesian clay that is merely a vehicle, sort of housing cognition or something like that, but is a proper and prominent part of what it is to know the world. This is influenced by Merleau-Ponty, the chiasm of the body. The body is simultaneously subjective and objective, and therefore is the proper bridge that makes all knowing possible between the subjective and the objective. This all has a huge influence on me. Junsun Kim and I have submitted a paper on a naturalistic account of qi or ki. I can't pronounce it in English, as you know, because we don't have that phoneme in English. That makes for this kind of argument about an embodied case. I didn't get to speak about it here, but the notion of relevance realization, which I think is the guts of our cognition, is deeply dependent on embodiment. Relevance realization, relevance is ultimately relevant to something that actually has real cares, real needs. And only autopoietic things, only living things, and in that sense, a living body, genuinely has cares. Because the body is the body mind, and there's no clean line between them, because the body mind is constantly taking care of itself and literally importing things from its environment to which it is coupled, from which it makes itself moment by moment. That's where the idea of important comes from, right? That is why we have to care about this information rather than that information. That's at the heart of relevance realization. It's the heart of meaning. It's at the heart of wisdom. This is why LLMs don't have cognition, because they're not autopoietic. They are not self-making. They do not literally care. And because they are not embodied and they literally don't care, they don't actually care and cannot care about overcoming self-deception. They don't care about what is true, good, or beautiful. They merely mimic it, which means wherever our judgments of relevance come apart from normal probability relationship between terms, their monstrosity is quickly revealed, and that has become very apparent. So the body, as a living autopoietic thing that is intrinsically embedded and coupled to its environment, and the environment and the embodied agent are constantly making each other in an ongoing process of niche construction. This is central to my whole project, and I would say it's central to all of 4E Cog Sci.
Beautiful. Thank you both. Àlex, John, thank you both. And if there are a few closing remarks or just a few as we wrap things up here.
One line here. So I knew, John, I knew you were an intellectual blessing. Today we could see you're more than that. And I can let the audience know that if they come in May, they'll experience you in present form. And it's even better from my recollections of being there in Scotland with you. So yeah, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Àlex. I don't know if I should be called an intellectual blessing, but I do appreciate, I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the context you provided. I appreciate our relationship. I appreciate the questions. They were astute, insightful. The follow-ups, the threading you did between them. I appreciate the questions I got. Many of them were tremendously insightful. And required me to reflect and sort of bring my A game to the answer. And I always enjoy that kind of respectful challenge. I have no interest in interacting with trolls, but When people really want to understand and they probe, I think that's really, really one of the, and I can appropriately respond, because sometimes I fail, but when I succeed in appropriately responding, that's a magic moment for me, and I'm deeply appreciative and grateful. So I also want to say thank you to both you and to everyone here, and also for the people that made this technologically possible.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Àlex, for dialoguing, and thank you, John, for fielding questions. And then, of course, thank you to our audience. It's really great to see everyone here in the new year. We do have a few events coming up, one tomorrow, and then another one next week, I believe. So please visit the Pari Center website. And John will be here with us in Pari in the spring. So if you'd like to actually interact with him directly in person, please sign up for our weekend program. So take care, and thank you all so much.